Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Professor S.P. Singh from Faculty of Management Studies, Gurukul Kangdi University, Haridwar. Today we are going to study Module 28 on interviews. After you finish this module, you shall be able to understand the focused interview, know the semi-standardized interview, comprehend the structure laying technique, know the problem laying technique, understand the problem-centered interview, comprehend the expert interview, and know the ethnographic interview. In the earlier periods of qualitative research, methodological deliberation rotated around observations as the key method for collecting data. Open interviews now attract more attention in the areas. Semi-structured interviews in particular are now widely used. This interest is based on the expectations that the viewpoints of the interviewed subjects are more likely to be expressed in an openly designed interview situation than in a structured interview or a questionnaire. The focused interview. In the focused interview, we present a uniform stimulus and study its impact on the interviewee using an interview guide. The basic aim of the interview is to provide a ground for interpreting statistically significant findings on the impact of media in mass communication. The stimulus presented is content analyzed prior to making a distinction between the objective facts of the situation and the interviewee's subjective definitions of the situation in order to compare them. During the design of the interview guide and the conducting of the interview itself, the four criteria are used: non-direction, specificity, range and depth, and personal context interview shows. Elements of the focused interview. Non-direction. Using several forms of questions may achieve non-direction. To begin with, the unstructured followed semi-structured questions. Either the concrete issue is defined and the response is left open, or the reaction is delineated and the concrete issue is left open. Unstructured questions should be asked first and introduced increased structuring only later during the interview to prevent the interviewer's frame of reference being imposed on the interviewee's viewpoints. In this respect, the flexible use of the interview schedule is needed. The interviewer should keep away as far as possible from making early evaluations and should perform a non-directive style of conversation. Problems may emerge if questions are asked at the wrong time, and interviewees are thus prevented from presenting their views. Specificity. The specificity criterion explain that the interview should emphasize the specific component which decide the impact or meaning of an event for the interviewees in order to prevent the interview from remaining on the level of general statements. For this purpose, the most appropriate forms of questions are those that handicap the interviewee the least. In order to enhance specificity, retrospective inspection should be encouraged. The interviewees should be supported in memorizing a specific situation by using materials in the form of an excerpt of a text, a picture, and the related questions. Range. The range aims at securing that all aspects and topics relevant to the research question are included during the interview. The interviewees must be provided the opportunity to present new topics of their own in the interview. The task of the interviewer is to cover the topical range by introducing new topics or initiating changes in the topic. This means as well that they should go back to topics that have been mentioned but not dealt in depth, especially if they gave the impression that the interviewee led the discussion away from a topic in order to shun it. However, in realizing this criterion, there is danger of confusing range with superficiality. To what extent this becomes a problem depends on the way the interviewers introduce the topical range of the interview guide and whether they become too dependent on the interview guide. The interviewers therefore should only mention topics if they really desire to ensure that have been dealt with in detail. Depth and personal context. Depth and personal context the interviewees show mean that the interviewers should secure that emotional responses in the interview exceed simple assessments such as happy or unhappy. The purpose is to get a maximum of self-revelatory comments relating to how the interviewee experienced the stimulus material. The concrete task for interviewers resulting from this goal is to uninterruptedly determine the current level of depth in order to change that level towards whichever end of the depth continuum he finds appropriate to the given case. Strategies for raising the degree of depth are, for example, to focus on feelings, restatement of implied or expressed feelings, and referring to comparative situations. A reference to the non-directive style of conducting a conversation can also be used. The application of the criteria in other areas of research is basically oriented to the common principles of the criteria. Concentrating on the interview is thought as concerned to the topic of study rather than to the use of stimuli such as films. Problems in conducting the interview. The criteria that Merton and Kendall suggested for conducting the interview admit certain targets which cannot be met in every situation. For example, specificity and depth versus range. Satisfying these criteria is not simple to be realized in advance. For example, at the stage designing the interview guide. To what extent they are really satisfied in an actual interview depends to a large extent on the real interview situation and how it explodes. These criteria show vivid interest in the decisions taken by the interviewers, establish and the necessary priorities for one particular occasion in the interview situation. The interviewer's situational competence determines the success in carrying out of such interviews. The practical experience of making necessary decisions in interview situations, rehearsal interviews as well as interview training may increase this competence. In training, interview situations are simulated and analyzed later in order to provide trainee interviewers some experience. There can be needs characterized by decisions between more depth accomplished by probing and ensuring the range by adding new topics or the next question of the interview guide and with different solutions at each point. This makes the difficulty of contradictory targets simpler to deal with, although they cannot be entirely resolved. Contribution to the general methodological discussion. The 4 criteria and the difficulties connected to them can be used to other kinds of interviews without using an advanced stimulus and dealing with other research questions. They have become usual criteria for designing and conducting interviews and a beginning point for describing difficulties in this method. Altogether, the concrete suggestions for realizing the criteria and for formulating questions may be applied as an orientation for conceptualizing and conducting interviews in more general way. To possibly focus on a specific object and its meaning has become a general aim of interviews. The same is the case for the strategies in order to realize these aims, primarily to provide the interviewees possible scope to add their views. Method fit into the research process. With this method, we can study the subjective viewpoints of different social groups. The purpose of such study may be to formulate hypotheses for subsequent quantitative studies, but also interpretation of experimental findings in more depth. Research questions concentrate on the impact of concrete events or the subjective handling of the conditions of one's own activities. Interpretation is not attached to a specific method. However, coding procedures appear to be most suitable. The semi-standardized interview. The semi-standardized interview is a special form of developing the method of interviewing interested in designing other forms of interviews. The subjective theory directs the attention to the fact that the interviewees have several interconnected parts of knowledge about the topic being studied. In order to articulate these, the methodological aids must support the interviewees. This is the reason for applying different types of questions used to reconstruct the interviewee's subjective theory about the issue being studied. By applying it together with the interviewees, their statements from the preceding interview form a structure. Elements of semi-standardized interview. The contents of the subjective theory are reconstructed during the interviews. The interview guide mentions several topical areas as an open question introduces and a confrontational question ends them. Open questions. Open questions may be answered based on the knowledge that the interviewee has at his disposal. Theory-driven, hypothesis-driven questions. In addition to open questions driven by theory and the questions directed by hypothesis are asked. The confrontational questions provide responses to the theories and relations the interviewee has presented up to that time for the purpose of critical examination of these notions in the light of competing alternatives. The structure laying technique. In a second assembly with the interviewee 1 or 2 weeks after the first interview, the structure laying technique is applied. In the meantime, the interview just outlined has been transcribed and roughly content analyzed. In the second meeting, the interviewee's necessary statements are presented to him or her as concepts on small cards for two purposes. The first is to evaluate the contents. The interviewers are asked to recollect the interview and verify if its contents are rightly denoted on the cards. The second objective is to structure the rest of the idea in a form resembling to scientific theories by applying the SLT rules and so on. The outcome of such a structuring process, applying the structure laying technique, is a graphic representation of a subjective theory. At the end, the interview compares the structure to the version that the interviewer has formulated in 2 meetings. Problems in applying this method. The confrontational questions may cause irritations to the interviewees, but to a certain extent it depends upon the interviewers to make the procedure comfortable to interviewees in both parts of the interview. If the interviewers are cautious to present alternative viewpoints, this could be a mode of dealing with the feeling of being annoyed. This approach is relevant in that the diverse kinds of questions permit the researchers to deal fully and clearly with the assumptions they carry to the interview in connection with the viewpoints of the interviewee. The principle of openness is changed in the form of a dialogue between positions as an outcome of the various degrees of explicit face-to-face with topics. In this dialogue, the interviewee's position is made more explicit and may also be made more advanced. The different kinds of questions denote different approaches to make implicit knowledge explicit, may direct towards the solution of a more common issue of qualitative research. A goal of interviews in general is to lay open existing knowledge in a way that can be stated in the form of answers and so become easy to interpretation. The structure laying technique. In a second assembly with the interviewees 1 or 2 weeks after the first interview, the structure laying technique is applied. In the meantime, the interview just outlined has been transcribed and roughly content analyzed. In the second meeting, the interviewee's necessary statements are presented to him or her as concepts on small cards or purposes. The problem-centered interview. Witzel developed the problem-centered interview in the context of biographical research. It suggests the way to formulate questions and the way to probe during the interview itself. In particular, by using an interview guide, incorporating questions and narrative stimuli, it is possible to collect biographical data with regard to a certain problem. 3 central criteria, including the problem centering, involving researchers' orientation to a relevant social problem, object orientation indicating that the methods are developed or modified with respect to an object of research, and thirdly, process orientation in the research process and in the understanding of the object of research characterize the problem-centered interview. The conversational entry, general and specific prompting, and ad hoc questions are the four central communicative strategies in a problem-centered interview. The theoretical background of the method is the interest in subjective viewpoints. Research questions are oriented to knowledge about facts or socialization processes. The selection of interviewees should proceed gradually in order to make the process orientation of the method work. This approach is not committed to any special method of interpretation, but mostly to coding procedures, and qualitative content analysis is mainly used. The expert interview. Muser and Nagel discussed the expert interview as a specific form of applying semi-structured interviews. As compared to biographical interviews, the interviewees are of less interest as an entire person than their capacities as experts for a certain field of activity. They are integrated into the study not as a single case but as a group. But who should be seen as an expert? The answer to the question, who or what are experts, can be very different depending on the issue of the study and the theoretical and analytical approach used in it. Those persons can be labeled as experts who are particularly competent as authorities on a certain matter of facts. This definition also includes persons as experts relating to their own biography or chronically ill individuals as experts for their illness. If expert interviews are used, mostly staff members of an organization with a specific function and a specific experience and knowledge are the target groups. The ethnographic interview. The participant observation is chiefly applied in the context of ethnographic field research. However, in applying it, the interviews also contribute. Here, a specific problem emerges concerning shaping conversations into interviews in the revelation of others' specific experience is aligned with the topic of research systematically. The local and temporal framework is not so explicitly delimited as in other interviews where time and place are definitely in order exclusively for the interview. Spreadley suggested that for conducting ethnographic interviews, it is best to consider ethnographic interviews as a number of friendly conversations into which the researcher adds new elements to help informants to respond as informants. Friends, in this module, you have studied the focused interview, the semi-standardized interview, the structure laying technique, the problem laying technique, the problem-centered interview, the expert interview, and the ethnographic interview. Thanks for visiting EPG Pathshala.